contact bearing 090, range 15 miles.
Load the breach! All hands, revert right.
Pacific Ocean, April 1945. The sky is still dark when the warning arrives. Not a shout, not a flare, just a thin green line sweeping across a circular screen deep inside a steel hull. Far above the waves, a single Japanese aircraft cuts through the night air. The engine vibrates violently. The pilot's hands are steady, but his breathing is not. He searches the horizon for silhouettes, masts, smoke, anything to aim for. There is nothing, only darkness. He does not know that he has already been seen. On an American destroyer miles away, radar operators watch the blip move closer. Range, speed, bearing, calculated without emotion. Orders pass quietly through headphones. Gun mounts rotate before the pilot can see the ship. Fuses are set. Timers vanish from the equation. When the sky erupts, it feels sudden to the man in the cockpit. Too sudden. Steel fragments tear through the air where no guns are visible. Explosions bloom at perfect altitude. Not aimed by eyes, but by machines. For the first time in the war, sacrifice is no longer enough. And as more aircraft approach from the darkness, the wider story of how this moment came to exist begins to take shape. By the middle of 1944, Japan's war was already slipping away. What began in December 1941 as a lightning campaign across the Pacific had become a grinding war of attrition. One Japan was never equipped to win. The Imperial Japanese Navy had gambled on speed, surprise, and elite aircrews. For a brief moment, that gamble worked. Pearl Harbor, the sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse, the fall of the Philippines, all were victories achieved by pilots trained to the highest pre-war standards. But Japan had built its air power on a fragile foundation. Training programs were long, expensive, and selective. Experienced aviators were considered irreplaceable assets, not expendable resources. When those pilots began to die in large numbers, at Coral Sea, Midway, and especially during the long campaign over Guadalcanal, the system collapsed. There was no reserve of trained men waiting behind them. By contrast, the United States transformed itself into an industrial engine of war. Aircraft factories expanded. Pilot training pipelines shortened without sacrificing quality. Radar schools, gunnery schools, and fleet coordination exercises multiplied. By 1943, the U.S. Navy was not merely replacing losses, it was improving with every engagement. The turning point in the air came during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Japanese carrier aviation, once feared, was effectively annihilated. Hundreds of aircraft were lost for minimal American damage. U.S. pilots later called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a phrase that revealed more than confidence. It revealed a widening technological gap. Japan could no longer contest the skies conventionally. As American forces island-hopped westward, through the Marshalls, the Marianas, and into the Philippines, Japanese planners faced a strategic nightmare. The U.S. fleet was growing larger, better protected, and increasingly immune to traditional attack methods. Bombers struck from beyond visual range. Fighters were guided by controllers who could see the enemy before the enemy could see them. Against this backdrop of decline, a desperate idea resurfaced. The concept of deliberate suicide attacks was not new in Japanese military culture, but it had never been formalized on a large scale. In October 1944, during the desperate defense of the Philippines, Vice Admiral Onishi Takajiro proposed what he called Tokubetsu Kogekitai, special attack units. The logic was cold and mathematical. A single pilot, diving at full speed into a ship, could do what dozens of conventional sorties could no longer achieve. The first organized kamikaze attack struck during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The initial results appeared to validate the concept. Several American ships were damaged or sunk. Fires raged on flight decks. Crews were shaken. Headlines traveled fast. But these early successes masked a deeper problem. Each kamikaze mission required something Japan no longer had in abundance: pilots who could reach the target. Fuel shortages limited training hours. New aviators often flew only a handful of times before combat. Navigation skills deteriorated. Formation discipline broke down. Many pilots never found the fleet at all, vanishing into the ocean without ever sighting an enemy ship. And as these attacks increased, something else began to emerge. Something invisible, silent, and utterly impersonal. American ships were no longer waiting to see the enemy. They were already tracking them. What the kamikaze pilots would soon face was not courage or gunnery skill alone, but an expanding electronic net that turned the night sky into a measurable, predictable space. A space where sacrifice could be intercepted long before impact. That unseen advantage was about to reshape the battle entirely. While Japan turned to sacrifice, the United States turned to systems. Radar had existed before the war, but it was the U.S. Navy that learned how to weaponize it completely, not as a warning tool alone, but as the backbone of fleet defense. By 1944, American warships were floating networks of detection, calculation, and controlled violence. At the center of this system was shipborne air search radar. Sets like the SK and SC could detect aircraft dozens of miles away, long before lookouts or pilots could see anything with the naked eye. This changed everything. An incoming attack was no longer a sudden crisis. It became a timeline. Once detected, radar information flowed instantly through Combat Information Centers, CICs, newly created spaces deep inside ships where officers track contacts on plotting boards. Speed, altitude, heading, and formation size were estimated in real time. Fighters were vectored toward incoming raids with calm, mathematical precision. But detection was only the first layer. The true revolution came with radar fire control. American naval guns had always been powerful, but accuracy depended on visibility. Smoke, weather, nightfall, all had once been allies of the attacker. Radar stripped those advantages away. Fire control systems like the Mk-37 Director, paired with radar sets such as the Mk-12 and Mk-22, could lock on aircraft electronically. Gun barrels followed radar echoes, not human eyesight. When the guns fired, they fired into calculated space. Then came the final piece, the proximity fuse. Officially known as the VT fuse, this small device transformed anti-aircraft warfare. Instead of detonating on impact or at a preset time, the fuse used a miniature radar transmitter. When the shell came close to an aircraft, it exploded automatically. Accuracy was no longer measured in direct hits. Near misses became lethal. The effect was immediate and devastating. During tests and early combat use, the number of rounds required to shoot down an aircraft dropped dramatically. Where thousands of shells had once been needed, now only hundreds were required. The sky around American ships became a layered kill zone. Long-range fighter interception, medium-range radar-directed gunfire, and close-range automatic weapons. This system did not depend on bravery or reaction time. It functioned continuously, even at night, even in storms. For American crews, training emphasized trust in instruments. Sailors learned to follow orders relayed from unseen operators. Gunners fired at targets they could not see. Radar operators, often young men barely out of school, carried the weight of life-and-death decisions on glowing screens. For Japanese pilots, this system was incomprehensible at first. Reports filtered back of aircraft destroyed before reaching visual range, of barges that seemed to anticipate maneuvers, of ships that fired accurately in darkness. The old rules, approach low, use clouds, attack at dusk, no longer worked reliably. As the Kamikaze program expanded, so did the American radar network. Radar picket ships were stationed miles from the main fleet, extending the detection envelope even further. Their role was dangerous but critical. Detect attackers early, by time, and feed targeting data to the guns. By early 1945, the U.S. Navy had built something unprecedented, a fleet that could see without looking, aim without watching, and kill without hesitation. And when mass kamikaze attacks met this system at full strength, the collision was brutal. What followed would not just test the pilots who volunteered to die. It would test whether human will could still matter in a sky ruled by machines. For many kamikaze pilots, the most terrifying part of the mission was not the dive. It was the approach. Young men, often barely trained, climbed into aging aircraft carrying bombs bolted beneath their fuselages. They wrote letters. They drank ceremonial sake. They saluted officers who knew they would never return. What awaited them in the air was supposed to be simple: find the enemy, aim, and strike. But over the open ocean, clarity vanished. Clouds obscured horizons. Navigation errors multiplied. Radio silence was enforced. Many pilots flew for hours without seeing a single ship. And when they finally did, something felt wrong. Explosions appeared in the sky long before gun flashes were visible. Aircraft ahead of them disintegrated suddenly, without warning. Survivors, rare as they were, described a growing sense of helplessness. They were being targeted before they could act. The enemy seemed to know where they were always. Fear did not negate devotion, but it changed it. These are no longer heroic charges against visible foes. They were silent hunts conducted by unseen observers. Radar-guided guns did not tire. They did not panic. They did not misjudge distance and darkness. Once an aircraft entered radar range, it became a data point. Fire control computers calculated lead angles automatically. Gun mounts tracked smoothly, correcting in fractions of seconds. The proximity fuse eliminated the need for direct impact, multiplying lethality. A kamikaze pilot flying at high speed had seconds, sometimes less, to react once engaged. Evasive maneuvers that once confused gunners now simply altered calculations. The shell did not need to hit. It only needed to come close. This was warfare without mercy, not from cruelty, but from efficiency. Each technological layer reduced randomness. Each improvement reduced the pilot's influence on his own fate. For American crews, the experience was equally strange. Gunners fired at empty skies. Radar operators watched blips vanish, then reappear as debris. Orders came calmly through headsets, range decreasing, altitude steady, target destroyed. There was no cheering, no visible enemy face. What replaced fear was responsibility. Every missed contact meant a ship might be hit. Every delayed call might cost lives. Sailors trusted screens they could not fully understand and weapons they could not see working. This was not personal combat. It was procedural survival. And as attacks intensified, both sides began to understand that the battle was no longer about courage alone. It was about whose system failed first. That realization would deepen as the war moved toward its most violent testing ground. By early 1945, the Pacific battlespace had been reorganized around radar. The U.S. Navy deployed radar picket destroyers and destroyer escorts miles ahead of the main fleet. Their mission was brutally simple: detect incoming aircraft as early as possible and absorb the first blows. These ships were lightly armored and heavily exposed, but they extended the fleet's electronic vision outward by dozens of miles. Once a contact appeared, the chain reaction began. Fighter direction officers vectored combat air patrols toward the threat. Gun directors locked in range and altitude. The fleet adjusted formation before the enemy could see it. For kamikaze pilots, this meant flying into a narrowing corridor of fire. The closer they came, the more intense the defenses became. Even successful penetrations often resulted in aircraft damaged so badly they missed their targets. The tactic of mass attack, overwhelming defenses through numbers, was tested repeatedly. It failed more often than it succeeded. Radar did not become confused by scale. More aircraft simply created more blips. Japanese commanders expected fearlessness. What they did not anticipate was anticipation. Pilots began to report that American ships fired accurately at night, through cloud, and even in rain. Traditional methods, low-level approaches, sun angles, staggered dives, produced diminishing returns. Pilots understood they were being hunted, not confronted. Diaries and post-war testimonies reveal a quiet truth. Many pilots feared the approach more than the impact. The idea of being destroyed before fulfilling their mission haunted them. Some expressed frustration, not at dying, but at dying without purpose. Faith alone could not counter an enemy that could see without looking. Japanese intelligence officers analyzed the pattern. Reports from Leyte and later from Okinawa noted a sharp increase in aircraft losses before reaching target areas. Radar-directed fire was specifically identified as a critical obstacle. By 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy understood the grim math. Kamikaze attacks could still damage ships, but at a cost that was unsustainable. Aircraft production could not keep pace with losses. Fuel shortages worsened. Training deteriorated further. The kamikaze weapon had not failed in principle. It had failed against a system designed to erase the individual. And that system would be tested to its limits during the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific, a battle where radar-guided guns would face sacrifice at unprecedented scale. The first true collision between mass kamikaze attacks and American radar defenses came in the Philippines. In October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf unfolded as the largest naval engagement in history. While surface actions and carrier duels dominated strategic planning, something new was happening in the air. Japanese special attack units were unleashed in numbers not previously seen. On October 25th, kamikaze aircraft struck U.S. escort carriers and destroyers east of Leyte. Ships like USS St. Lo were hit, sometimes fatally. Flames engulfed decks. Ammunition cooked off. For a brief moment, it appeared the new tactic could still disrupt American momentum. But beneath the chaos, the trend was already shifting. Radar plots from Leyte showed aircraft detected far earlier than in previous campaigns. Fighter direction improved daily. Gun crews refined radar tracking procedures under fire. Each engagement fed data back into training manuals and tactical adjustments. By November, American ships were destroying increasing numbers of attackers before they reached dive range. Kill zones expanded. Radar operators learned to differentiate single aircraft from formations, even at low altitude. The proximity fuse proved decisive. Aircraft that once might have slipped through curtains of flak now detonated in midair. Japanese pilots noticed the change immediately. Approaches that once lasted minutes now ended in seconds. Entire formations vanished ahead of them. Explosions appeared in empty sky, followed by falling debris. The fleet seemed surrounded by an invisible wall. Despite this, the kamikaze campaign intensified. Japanese leadership believed volume could still overwhelm technology. New units were formed. Even trainers were pressed into service. The human cost was accepted as necessary. As the war moved north toward the Ryukyu Islands, both sides prepared for a confrontation unlike any before. Okinawa would place the U.S. fleet within range of thousands of aircraft based on Kyushu. It would also place radar-guided defense under constant, exhausting pressure. By March 1945, American radar picket ships formed a wide arc around Okinawa. Their screens glowed constantly. Operators slept in shifts. Contacts appeared day and night. The stage was set for the ultimate test, a sustained assault where sacrifice would be measured not by courage, but by whether it could penetrate a sky already claimed by machines. April 1st, 1945. Okinawa. As American troops stormed ashore, the sea around the island became the most dangerous place in the Pacific. For Japan, this was the final defensive line before the home islands. For the U.S. Navy, it was the ultimate test of radar warfare under relentless attack. Japanese planners launched Kikusui, massed waves of kamikaze assaults. Hundreds of aircraft at a time rose from airfields across Kyushu. Some were fighters, some were bombers, some were barely airworthy trainers. All were aimed at the fleet, but the moment they left land, they entered a different world. Radar picket destroyers detected them while they were still forming up. Blips multiplied across scopes. Course lines converged toward Okinawa. Warnings rippled through the fleet long before the first engine could be heard. Combat air patrols intercepted many attackers far out. Others pressed on. As kamikazes crossed into gun range, radar-directed fire took over. Directors tracked targets through cloud and smoke. Shells burst at calculated altitudes. VD fuzes detonated precisely where aircraft would be, not where they had been. The sky erupted continuously. Pilots who survived the outer defenses flew into increasingly dense fire. Ships fired without pause. Barrels glowed. Crews rotated positions while the screens never slept. Aircraft disintegrated in midair, sometimes close enough for debris to strike the ships below. Some kamikazes still got through. Radar picket ships paid heavily. USS Laffey, USS Bush, USS Colquhoun. Many were hit, damaged, or sunk. Sailors died. Fires burned. Yet for every aircraft that struck home, dozens were destroyed. Japanese losses were catastrophic. During the Okinawa campaign, thousands of aircraft were expended. The majority never reached a target. Many were destroyed miles away from the fleet. Others were crippled and crashed short of impact. Radar-guided defenses had turned the approach itself into a lethal gauntlet. Japanese after-action assessments quietly acknowledged the truth. Radar-controlled anti-aircraft fire had become the single greatest obstacle to special attack success. Pilots described explosions appearing from nowhere. Maneuvers were anticipated. Darkness offered no protection. By June 1945, the kamikaze weapon had reached its limit. It could still wound, but it could no longer decide the battle. The American fleet remained in place. Okinawa fell. The turning point had passed. What followed was not a question of whether radar-guided guns worked, but what their dominance meant for the future of war. When the battle for Okinawa ended in June 1945, the sea around the island was littered with wreckage. More than 30 American ships had been sunk during the campaign, and hundreds more damaged. Nearly 5,000 U.S. sailors were killed. For the men who served on radar picket ships, survival often felt like chance rather than design. But when the numbers were fully compiled, a different picture emerged. Japan had lost an estimated 1,900 to 2,000 aircraft in kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa campaign alone. Many were destroyed without ever seeing their target. Others were shot down so far from the fleet that their wreckage fell unnoticed into the sea. The exchange ratio was devastatingly lopsided. Analysts studying the engagements noted a sharp decline in kamikaze effectiveness over time. Early attacks achieved limited tactical success. Later waves suffered extreme losses for minimal damage. Radar-guided gunfire, combined with fighter interception, steadily reduced the probability of impact. The psychological effect on American crews was equally important. Confidence in radar systems grew with each engagement. Sailors learned to trust screens more than sight. Ships refined coordination between detection, command, and firepower. What had once seemed experimental became routine. For Japan, the realization was grim. The Kamikaze program had been conceived as a decisive weapon, a way to compensate for material inferiority with human will. Instead, it collided with an enemy whose defenses were designed to remove the individual from the equation. Even Japanese officers who supported the program admitted after the war that radar had fundamentally changed the balance. Sacrifice could not overwhelm a system that detected, tracked, and destroyed attackers long before they could act. The sky had become controlled space. And as both sides absorbed the lessons of Okinawa, it became clear that this was not just the end of a campaign, it was the end of a way of fighting. In the months after Okinawa, both sides studied what had happened with sober clarity. For Japan, there was little ambiguity. Post-war interrogations, surviving intelligence reports, and pilot testimonies converged on the same conclusion. Radar-controlled American defenses had fundamentally neutralized the kamikaze threat. The problem was not courage. It was access. Pilots could no longer reliably reach their targets. Japanese naval officers later admitted that once radar picket systems and proximity fuses were fully deployed, special attack units lost their strategic value. Losses became unsustainable. Aircraft production collapsed under bombing. Fuel shortages worsened. Training time dropped to dangerous minimums. The kamikaze campaign, once envisioned as a final shield for the homeland, had been bled dry before it could serve that purpose. For the United States Navy, the lessons were transformative. Radar-guided fire control was no longer considered an innovation. It was doctrine. Fleet air defense planning after 1945 placed electronics at the center of naval warfare. Detection ranges increased. Automation expanded. Command and control systems grew more complex and centralized. The experiences of radar picket ships directly influenced Cold War naval design. Early warning destroyers, missile cruisers, and later Aegis-equipped warships all traced their lineage back to the glowing screens off Okinawa. The principle was clear. See first, decide first, strike first. Perhaps most importantly, the nature of combat had shifted psychologically. The enemy was no longer encountered face-to-face. He appeared as a symbol on a screen. His destruction was recorded as a vanishing signal. The emotional distance created by radar warfare changed how sailors experienced killing and how nations calculated risk. By August 1945, as Japan surrendered, the implications of this shift were already understood by those who had lived inside it. The age of visual combat was over. The age of electronic warfare had begun, and with it came a quiet, unsettling truth that future wars would be decided not by who was willing to die, but by who could see without being seen. The story of kamikazes facing radar-guided guns is more than a tale of destruction. It is a testament to the collision between human courage and technological inevitability. Young men volunteered to die, their devotion absolute. Yet no bravery, no training, no ritual could pierce the wall of electrons, steel, and mathematics that the U.S. Navy had erected. Machines did not tire, did not hesitate, did not grieve. The sky itself became a measured space, a realm where human was only one variable among many. For the sailors on the fleet, survival depended on trust in systems they could not fully see. They learned to fight through instruments, to believe in what glowing blips and plotting boards indicated, and to act as conduits for the calculations of unseen minds. The horror of battle remained, but the battlefield had shifted from instinct and reflex to prediction and precision. For history, the lesson was stark. The Kamikaze program showed that determination could be quantified, and once an enemy could measure it, it could be countered. The Pacific Ocean, once dominated by daring and sacrifice, became dominated by sensors and fire control networks. The future of warfare was revealed. Victory would not always belong to the fearless, but to the calculated, the technologically prepared, and the unseen. And in that revelation lies both awe and sorrow. Awe for human ingenuity, sorrow for the courage that found itself powerless against an invisible, unstoppable force. The age of electronic eyes had arrived, and with it, a quiet revolution in the way war would be fought for decades to come.